Hello, everybody. I am Deyasini and I welcome you all to the Stories of the Indian Diaspora series with reference to TMYS Review's June 2021 project that invites stories on the Indian diaspora. This is basically to investigate the ambition based movement under our annual theme of migration, resettlement, and displacement. Today, we are honored to present Dr. Manu Bhagavan. Uh, he is a professor of history and human rights at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, CUNY, and senior fellow at the Ralph Bunche Institute. He is the author of The Peacemakers and Sovereign Spheres and the co-editor of four other books. He's currently working on a biography of Madam Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, the first woman in the world to become a celebrity diplomat. His Quads essay on global authoritarianism went viral internationally and was translated into German as the cover article of the May 2016 Berliner Republic magazine. He's a recipient of a 2006 fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies and regularly appears in the media to comment on global affairs. We welcome you, sir, and a very good morning to you.
Good morning from New York and good evening in India.
Uh, Also, we have Samina joining us today from the US. She is an associate professor at Erickson Institute in Chicago, where she teaches courses in child development. Her first book of poems, Muslim Melancholia, was published by Red Mountain Press. She has published poems in international journals of repute. Her poems were performed on stage in 2017 as a part of Kundimant Foundation and Emotive Fusion event focusing on Asian American poetry. In 2018, she was named a semi-finalist for the Gwendolyn Brooks Poetry Award in Chicago. We welcome you, Samina, and I would now request you to proceed with your question.
Good morning, everyone, and good evening. Manu, my first question is this. The title of our program is Tell Me Your Story. So do you want to begin by telling us your story of migration, your family story, and where and how you traveled across this globe to get to where you are today?
Sure. Well, first, good morning and good evening to everyone tuning in. And a word of thanks to Coral Dasgupta and Tell Me Your Story for inviting me on here today, and to Deyasini for organizing all of this, and Samina for being part of it. I'll just try to give you a very ultra tight version of my story. In terms of a story of immigration, my story really involves my parents. So we're Kannadiga from what is today Karnataka state, what previously was Mysore state in India. And my father trained as a medical doctor. He got married at a relatively young age. And then he was posted. He got an offer and took up a post as a tribal doctor in NAFA, the Northeast Frontier Agency in India, and he worked there for some time before he returned to take up a post with the Mysore government in a medical college in India, where he helped to develop pathology as a field and discipline. And while he was doing that, an American doctor came to visit. The American doctor had trained one of the chiefs in the department where my dad was working, who was his friend. The American doctor worked at a hospital in Baltimore called Sinai Hospital. He was a Jewish person, and he came to Mysore, gave some lectures, met my father, thought he was very interesting, and invited him to come to the United States for training, for further training. So my father sort of made plans to do this, and in the interim, he and my mother had their first child, my eldest sister, Minnie. And then he came over to Baltimore and started working in Sinai Hospital, and he did very well there, and they were sort of very enthusiastic about his presence. So although it was originally the idea that he would come for a temporary period, it started to get extended. So my mother came over, leaving my sister in India. And my father and mother were over here for several years with my sister in India, and she didn't come until I think she was about 5 years old. By the time she came over here, she had no understanding of who my parents were. She didn't know who they were. So that took a period of adjustment for her. Shortly after she got here, my parents had another baby, my middle sister, Anita. She was born with a congenital heart problem. And ultimately, she required an urgent kind of surgery, which was done at Johns Hopkins, which was the top hospital at the time. And she died in operation. So that was very hard on my parents. Now, in the interim, the hospital was interested in keeping my father on staff for a longer period of time. And so ultimately, bills were introduced in the American Congress with my family's name on it because immigration laws did not allow for a restructuring of a visa while they were here. And so the bills were introduced in Congress, and this then allowed them to stay in the country as a ward of Congress. So this happened twice. 2 bills were introduced. And then after my sister died, this was a very difficult moment for my parents, and they and it was a long-standing one. Anyway, ultimately they had me, and out of precaution, they took some time before they did anything else, about 2 years. And then my mother had left. She was sort of in the middle of doing a bachelor's degree in India and had left it. And then she came here. She became a technologist within pathology and was working at the hospital. And my father had been elevated to sort of co-chief already. Very rapid rise. And she decided that she would go back to India to finish her degree at Mysore University. So I would accompany her. And so in my very young formative developmental years, I grew up in parts of Karnataka, in Tiptur, which is a small town sort of outside of Bangalore. And so I grew up in Bangalore and Tiptur in India, with stopovers in Madras and Bombay, and in Baltimore in the United States. And I guess in a nutshell, that's the story of migration that's involved. I don't know how much more detail you want me to go into. That's in a nutshell the story.
That's great. And then you eventually returned back to Baltimore, and did you spend your adolescence there in adulthood?
Yes, no. So my mother would go back and forth. She didn't go back and live permanently in Tiptur. She would travel back and forth. So we would go for a period of time, stay there in her family home. And I would mostly get in the way by getting into various kinds of mischief. So we have a very large family, and they would sort of take over responsibility for me and let her study. And then anyway, just to finish off the story of my parents, my father became a co-inventor of the automatic internal defibrillator. and then ultimately became the chief of pathology at Sinai and a professor at Hopkins. And my mother transitioned into the field of banking, and those were the two things that they did. And then after she completed her schooling, came back, and I did all of my schooling in Baltimore. I attended both public and private institutions, and then eventually I went on to do my education involves both public and private schools.
Great, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay, so my question is on your book Sovereign Spheres. Chapter 4 of Sovereign Spheres investigates the push for a new university at Baroda without British influence and interference, representing a refashioned and new modernity, and the creation of which was seen as a radical step against the imperial domination. So, do you really think these rebel academies serve as a hidden transcript of resistance and can be seen as should be seen as assaults only on the ideological soul of colonialism in the historiographical remodeling of colonial India?
Well, thank you for that detailed question, Deyasini. So what you're referring to is my first book, which was my dissertation converted into academic monograph, Sovereign Spheres. And the argument in that book is that princely states had they were semi-autonomous, and so could carve out both unique policies and relationships with the colonial power, and through this means they could also refashion elements of governance and institutions and organizations of the state. And one of the key institutions that they refashioned was the university. And I look in particular at two states. Baroda is one, and Mysore is the other. So what becomes MS University Baroda and Mysore University. The argument about the rebel academies is that they, in thinking about them, the princely administrations were sort of articulating a form of independence versus colonial administration, and using both the infrastructure and administration of the university, as well as the idea of the university, as a means of contrasting some of the logics of colonial control. The logics being that, much like what you are referring to, sort of derivative of Thomas Babington Macaulay's famous Minute on Education in the early 19th century, that in order to properly civilize people around the world, in this particular case, the people of India, Western education was used to create a group of brown Englishmen to serve essentially as middlemen and propel empire forward. This sort of turned a lot of that on its head and said that these were spheres in which free thinking could be allowed, and in free thinking, they would question a lot of the assumptions underlying colonialism, which was full of loopholes and hypocrisies anyway. So the answer is, do I think that it served successfully as a hidden transcript? Absolutely. That was the point of the book. If you're asking a separate question, which is, do the universities that were created, Mysore and MS University, or universities more broadly, continue to serve that purpose? Well, I don't think that isn't really the argument. The argument is located in a particular historical context. And I think the takeaway, though, is that institutions are always re-articulated in their moment. And so we should always be thinking about what purposes institutions serve, what some of their shortcomings are, and what some of their overall asset values are.
Thank you so much, sir. Okay, moving on to my next question. From cancellation of refugee protection, zero tolerance to racism, profiling, discrimination, the resurgence of nationalism is hitting the globalized population head on. What do you think USC is today for Indians, and how difficult it has been for you to make home in the land of and to pursue the American dream?
So this is a challenging question. What I would say is that we've been witnessing rising tides of nationalism around the world, which coincide with anti-democratic views and a rise of what we initially called authoritarian populism, but which associationally has margins in fascism, and there is, we can sort of loosely say, sort of a burgeoning neo-fascist movement in the world today as well, which is international and internationally connected. So over the course of the last 4 years, the previous 4 years, we saw a rise in loosely what's termed hate crimes, or crimes against various kinds of communities based on the way they self-identify, or identified by others based on their religion or ethnicity, or their minority status in a particular community. And these communities are often used as scapegoats for a variety of complaints that other members of their society may have. And that this in turn has been exacerbated by the rhetoric of a number of these global authoritarian figures. In the United States in particular, the previous president delighted in flame-throwing and in exacerbating these kinds of tensions, and often did this, whatever benefit that they thought they could glean from doing this, they would. So the result has obviously been a very challenging 4 years, and that people spent, sorry?
Please continue, sir. Please continue.
Yeah. The result has obviously been very challenging for 4 years, to the extent that people's sense of security and belonging was really under threat, and it was a very scary time, for sure. Not just in the United States. I want to be clear. This was happening around the world, and in many cases it is still happening. Now, the United States managed to turn this back, but where things stand now, I wouldn't say that the previous way is completely defeated. So we're sort of in a pivotal moment. And which direction things take is still yet to be determined. A lot of work has to be done. Obviously, the new administration, and this isn't just about political administrations, but that can play a role in terms of the bully pulpit that they have. The new administration, converse to the previous one, celebrates diversity and the contribution of all different members of society. The cabinet is much more diverse looking, and they also rhetorically are much more inclusive. So far, politically, in terms of the things that they, policies that they are pushing, in terms of executive orders and in terms of the first bill that they got through Congress, also are more inclusive and are things that look to make people feel heard and seen. Obviously, the tension here ultimately is between one of the problems in a place like the United States, to be specific to your question, is that there is a community of people here who themselves have not done well over the last several decades. By not doing well, I mean economically, that they're frustrated about lack of opportunity, about changing dynamics in various fields that have looked to to shut down opportunities for them and their families. And the result has been to play up sort of racist fears and blaming immigrants and migrants for a lot of the situation. So the balance is between trying to figure out ways to reach all people who are hurting and to try to lift all boats, and to get rid of this notion that if one community does better, it's at the expense, by necessity, of another community who is also suffering. Really, the issue is that those who are doing well really need to take responsibility and to do everything that they can, both individually but also societally through policies and government initiative to ameliorate these conditions.
Okay.
So
Thank you, sir. Samina, please take it ahead.
So it's not a zero-sum game. Would you say that in relation to this idea of how everyone's rights should be validated?
Yes, I'd say it is not a zero-sum game, and to argue that it is part of the problem. And there's political expediency in arguing that if one group is benefiting, that another group is going to have something taken away. That plays to that second group's fears, and then they react against these kinds of changes, and then in their fear, that can lead to obvious sort of dramatic mobilization. So I think that's the logic behind zero-sum rhetoric. On the other hand, I do want to be clear that not everything is always possible to say that everyone is always going to benefit at all times. Sometimes some people need to give a little. So, for example, if you have people holding, whatever, all the nuts, well, they're going to have to share some of those nuts with other people in order for everyone to have something to eat. And so that is still not a zero-sum game. Sharing is not zero-sum. It's not taking away everything from one group. It's simply saying that we need to make sure that everybody has some. And the principle, the longstanding ideal in the United States, is equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity is a easy phrase to use. It's a more difficult kind of concept to do in practice. So it's not just that everyone has the chance to apply for something if all kinds of barriers are in the way that harm, various applicants' ability to get to this front door. So you want to make sure that everyone has the chance to get to the front door equally.
Thank you, Manu. I'm going to switch topics here. You are a prolific writer, and you have books that are steeped in history and anthropology and sociology, as well as a very rich theoretical background. For our viewers, you talk a lot about modern India. So could you define, what do you mean by modern India? And is India still struggling with its concept of modernity?
These are great questions. So I'd say that there are two ways to answer two concepts simultaneously at work in the idea of modern India, maybe three. One is a grappling with this concept of modernity. What does modernity mean? And in that sense, modernity is a concept which is a relative recent creation, a sort of a post-Enlightenment grappling with various kinds of ideals like freedom and democracy, things of this sort. And the question, one of the questions, theoretical questions that people grapple with is whether modernity is something that is inherently and fundamentally Western, or whether that there are non-Western modernities, or whether there are universalistic ways in which modernity can be framed, which by universalism, we also mean that is non-discriminatory, non-biased against various kinds of communities that take into consideration historical trajectories from all different peoples of the world. And that's a question that hasn't sort of fundamentally been answered, but there is a lot of work to suggest, A, there have been, are, and will continue to be non-Western modernities. So the answer to that question is yes. And that these non-Western modernities challenge the premise and the assumption of the universality of Western modernity. So the answer to the second question is yes. And what is unresolved is whether or not this can all be formulated into a streamlined kind of universalism that everyone can sort of buy into. That's up in the air, and obviously contested by many sides. So that's one set of questions which are involved with the idea of modern India. The second is just temporal. Modern India can mean, depending on how it's framed, from the Mughal era forward, it can mean from the British era forward, and it can also mean from independence forward. And so it depends on how people want to frame it, and how what is invested both in the term modern and in the term India. So I'd say that you're asking a very good but extremely complicated question around which many, many debates circulate. And ultimately, what we're thinking about and talking about when we use terms like modern India are temporal questions and theoretical ones as well. How and why do we define modernity in certain ways? What ideals do we associate? What ideals, principles, ideologies do we associate with being modern, and why? Should some of the historically used ones be discarded? Should we adopt new ones? Or are there core values which are essential to modernity? These are some of the questions that both academics and theoreticians, as well as those involved with praxis, deal with regularly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So my next question also has a big theoretical construct in it as well. So if you could help us define that term, post-colonial India, is it also a temporal response in the sense this is post-independence India? Are we truly a post-colonial nation, or would you define this as more neo-colonial? Where do you think India is right now? And what does that term mean, post-colonial India?
Right. So post-coloniality is a term which I would sort of put in the same category as modernity here, which is there are many ways to think about it. On the one hand, yes, sort of temporally, India after formal colonialism, or modern India, again, to use the previous phrase. But on the other hand, post-coloniality is a much deeper and more complicated concept, which is about rejecting the ideological basis and intellectual foundation of the entire colonial enterprise. And at its heart, colonialism involved discrimination, exploitation, and ultimately power. And so how do you upend these things? How do you challenge them? And how do you reconstruct society or societies in a way that doesn't simply invert the whole thing and then fall prey to it again? That is a very good question implied in yours, which is, does post-coloniality simply mean like a reversing the enterprise and asserting dominance by buying into the original premise, just inverting it? And I would hope not. That was not the intention of many who were challenging the basis of colonialism, or the larger ideology of imperialism. The point is to try to beat back these notions of supremacy, which underlie those forms of exploitation, and to build pathways, both for nonviolent resolution or diplomacy, the international conflict, as well as pathways for betterment for groups and for communities that have been historically excluded.
Thank you.
Sir, how would you define cultural identity? Do you wish to move away from the hegemonic notion of diaspora as a discourse of exile, cultural loss, and unsettledness towards a reading of diaspora as a discourse of attachment, rootedness, and national desire?
Well, I'd say diaspora is many things. And I don't know that we necessarily need to juxtapose those two things. People can feel exile and displacement while also searching for rootedness. In fact, those two things can lead to one another, while searching for rootedness and then refashioning a form of nationalism. This is sort of at a broad and abstract level. At individual levels, how people navigate and find a sense of home or belonging is something that is endemic to the process of migration slash emigration or immigration, where people are in search of a concept of home. And some of that then leads to imaginary homelands. Sort of you refashion a construct of the place that you left and you idealize it, you romanticize it, or inversely, that kind of process in the place that you just moved to. Ultimately, on the other hand, it can also, sort of people can navigate these things in multiple ways. They can feel like they have no sense of home and no sense of belonging. They're constantly on the margins or always outside looking in. And inversely, they can feel like they belong everywhere, like they're comfortable. I think the latter is a more rare occurrence, but not an unheard of one. Often the folks who feel like they belong everywhere are also incorporating various other kinds of privileges. Like it can go hand in hand with class and other means of entree into similar sectors of society while traveling. Because there are so many different variables involved with communities when they migrate, I'd say that it's impossible to think about this in any kind of situated juxtaposition of concepts, that there are multiple layers involved at all times, and that they're constantly in negotiation with one another, dependent upon individuals, upon groups, and upon societies. Just to be a little bit, perhaps, to give you a material example, something specific that we can think about. Sort of migration of Dalit communities from South Asia that has occurred over time, but building up of Dalit networks where migrants can reach out to other members of communities with similar histories or that they have associational bonds with, is something that is in the process of developing now, and that's creating pathways for both migrant communities to feel grounded and have opportunities in new ways, and also in terms of opportunities for families back home, whether that's because of money being sent back home in terms of remittances or reverse migration. I don't mean that they move back, but that they go back and forth and take ideas or capital back with them, or they open up and afford other opportunities for members of communities back home to further migrate. So those are some examples, I think, of things to think about that are involved with migratory patterns broadly and the experience of migration for different communities. And ultimately, unsettled is the right term only because it's not so much that each individual or community might feel unsettled, but because the concepts themselves are unsettled, and that we can't stabilize this and say it's transitioning away from that to this, only because the experience at an individual level will always be unique. And then that's magnified by opportunities that go hand in hand with larger community patterns of migration as well.
Thank you, Manu.
Thank you, sir. Please take it ahead, Samina.
Yeah, the next question kind of piggybacks on your earlier response. You're here in the United States and you're seeing the Black Lives Movement enroll and unfold. And just recently, a young African-American boy was murdered outside of Minneapolis just a few days ago. Do you see parallels between the Black Lives Movement and the Dalit right movement that you're seeing within India and its diaspora?
I'd say that there have been historical associations between Dalit right movements and some American, in particular American, race justice movements, and those go back a ways. Obviously, Dr. Ambedkar himself studied in the United States. I don't know that but he studied at Columbia, as did you, Samina. I don't know that he necessarily sort of drew specific inspiration from race justice movements here, but the point I'm trying to make is simply that there have been some associational values, and obviously, say the Dalit Panthers or Black Panthers have associational values over time. But having said that, Black Lives Matter is as a social justice movement, is something that has caught the national attention and the international attention of people, of communities in a particular way. And I would say that the Dalit rights movement has not comparatively done that kind of thing as yet. Having said that, there are obvious base parallels between the issues at play, which is that in India, there are communities that have historically been not only neglected, but institutionally oppressed and harmed, and systematically excluded from the basis of society. And this has caused indescribable harm. then much like the news cycle in the United States, there are repeated stories of grotesque crimes committed against various members of the Dalit community throughout India. It's not just located in one city or one region. I mean, these episodes occur in different places around the country repeatedly. And so in that sense, caste is not something that has been eliminated or uprooted in any sense from India. And how Dalit communities have to negotiate this and envision a different kind of future is up in the air, and in that sense there are parallels with what the African American community is going through. So although Black Lives Matter in the United States has taken up a lot of space, a lot of energy in terms of media coverage, and in terms of sort of the mobilization of peoples or communities, at the same time, these episodes of grotesque, horrific violence committed against African American people has not stopped at all. The one episode after another just keeps occurring. So what Black Lives Matter is helping to do is to bring attention to the fact that this is ongoing through technology like cell phones and so on, and sort of using this hashtag Black Lives Matter to call attention to the fact that this is really unacceptable. I would hope that people in India, not necessarily because of what's happening with Black Lives Matter, but just on the basis of it being what it is, would ultimately conclude that it is the right thing, it is the necessary thing to end systemic violence against such communities, and to take responsibility for what has been done. It's easy to say these things in an interview. It's very difficult to accomplish them. And that takes a lot of work on the part of a lot of people to think through and to come to terms with, and then to change. So in a nutshell, the answer would be, are there parallels between the claims being made by Black Lives Matter, that Black Lives Matter, and something like a Dalit Lives Matter campaign in India? Yes. And that is that every person has the fundamental right to be treated as a human being, and that they have certain fundamental rights that go along with that. At the sort of specific applied level, I'd say that that people who are interested in developing, promoting an end to endemic violence against specific Dalit communities, specifically Dalit communities in South Asia, have work to do.
Thank you. My last question, Deyasini, I think I have this last question, is looking at India today on the international stage. So you also talk about how India is caught between Russia and the United States, right? As well as living in the shadows of the British Empire. So if you want to talk a little bit about where India is today on the international stage.
Well, I'd say that internationally, India is a very important country, and its importance is only increasing. It is important for several reasons, not the least of which has to do with its size and potential purchasing power, but obviously the size of its economy more broadly. So not only in terms of consumption, but in terms of potential production. it is important, ever increasingly so, in terms of its potential military contributions, and it is important and has historically been so diplomatically for trying to prevent conflict from overtaking the world again, and for trying to resolve things through backroom channels and negotiation. India has historically been one of the largest contributors to peacekeeping efforts in the world through UN peacekeeping, contributing all kinds of things, but particularly human power. And so I think India is an essential country in the world. All countries are essential in a sense, but what I mean by that is simply that it is a country without whom long-term solutions to pressing problems cannot be had. As an example, right now, and the most pressing issue around the world is this pandemic. And a solution, an end to this pandemic cannot and will not happen without India. And that's because India's pharmaceutical industry is one of the largest and most important in the world in terms of being able to produce widely available medicine, which much of the world is dependent upon. In this case, specifically to produce the vaccines themselves. The Serum Institute in Pune is obviously one specific place where this occurs, but the overall generics industry in India is also potentially can be involved. Sorry, were you saying something? I just hear something in the background.
No, I'm fine. Thank you.
So does that answer the question? I think India is still looking, to use a phrase from a colleague of mine, is still looking for a seat at the high table, a permanent seat at the high table, shall we say? It definitely has a rotating chair that it comes in on. I think the stability of its place at that table is still to be determined, but I think it gets harder and harder and harder to exclude India moving forward without it, because regardless of these nationalist movements, the world remains incredibly interconnected economically, financially, as well as in terms of global migration and so on. And it becomes hard when 1 in 5 people around the world is Indian to envision any kind of pathway forward, whether in terms of international relations, in terms of global peace, or in terms of sort of negotiated settlements to target climate change or vector-borne disease that stems from that, or things like specifically this pandemic, without Indian involvement. So is India important internationally? Yes. Does it continue to have a high wire act to walk, to negotiate between all kinds of other powered interests? Yes. And is it easy which side India should necessarily take? No. So, I mean, I could go on talking about that, but I think that sort of highlights the basic premise.
I think that's a great metaphor. It's trying to find a seat at that high table.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so sir, this will be my last question. Uh, there have been several accounts of international conflicts, of wars, cultural, militarized, each being its own spinning silk rope. Would you agree that America can be called a melting pot? And if yes, how much is that in consonance with the idea of one world that you have envisioned in the Peacemakers?
Okay, well, I think the specific concept of a melting pot is a bit of a cliche, if you will, that historically was used to refer to all different people coming to the United States and then sort of blending together, and it also sort of homogenized. Uh, um, it had sort of a homogenous understanding of what Americanness was. And the melting pot metaphor was one that also was circulated widely when, although there was sort of some diverse immigration, that Black people continued to be fundamentally excluded, and that there was a white racial normativity in the country. That is to say that things were still determined on the basis of a particular racialized understanding of what the country meant. So on the other hand, it is true that people from all over the world came to the United States to find opportunity, and many people did. And there is this constant tension in that narrative between the United States as a land of ideals and opportunity and the United States as a militaristic operation, which has military bases around the world and has sort of expanded its economic reach into all kinds of places. And sort of the balance, sort of thinking through these kinds of both historical truths and trends, and the larger imaginative ways that the country has existed that transcends those and that continues to inspire people around the world. The United States has never really had this tension resolved, and I'd say, though, that it is unfair to dismiss either side of those tensions, that you can't believe in the ideals and then wish away some of the other stuff that the country has been involved in. On the other hand, you can't constantly criticize the country for some of those other things without understanding how much the country has meant to people, the ideal of the country, the ideals that it stands for has meant to people, has meant to communities who've migrated into it, and that serves as an inspiration for people around the world. So I think one of the things that's key to think about is that this tension is also not unique to the United States per se, that every country has these kinds of tensions between practices which are problematic or flawed, or deep histories of internal discrimination or problematic external relations, and claims to inclusivity and a brighter future for all people. And so negotiating those pathways forward is something that dreamers for a century have envisioned, have hoped for, have worked towards. And obviously, there have been many, many setbacks on that path forward. Does anyone believe the path forward is inevitable, is an inevitable one? No, I don't think so. Well, except perhaps for the most idealistic. But most understand that to walk the path of resolving tension is a fraught one, one with many setbacks, both historically in the current where we are at the moment and moving forward. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't the path that we should be taking.
Okay, okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you for that beautiful answer. And thank you once again for your time and for sharing with us your knowledgeable insights. And with this, we end the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Samina. Thanks, Deyasini.
Bye-bye.